The Director General of the Department of International Relations and Cooperation, Zain Dangor, has hailed the G20 summit as a victory for the African continent. He says the negotiations focused on several issues, including debt sustainability and sovereignty over national resources. For the first time, the summit held here on our continent, leaders gathered in Joburg, South Africa, playing host. Despite some tense diplomacy, the final declaration focused on Africa's development, debt relief and climate action.
From the onset, we wanted to make sure that, our themes have resonance for African economies, but also just for African people. So in every element of the negotiation, starting in December last year, in framing the themes and our priorities, we centered the African agenda. In the negotiations themselves, we made sure that African issues are not relegated as ones that can be negotiated out. So that's why the negotiations were so long. It's Africa, but also the developing South that we thought should, be brought into this particular G20 with the perspective of working with others to implement them.
Well, just as G20 leaders, I presume, are on their way home, so South Africa is now hosting its first climate summit. That's after the commitments from G20 leaders to do more to help stop climate change. Shameela Soobramoney is the CEO of the National Business Initiative. They're hosting the summit. Shameela, good afternoon to you. What do you believe this summit should be aiming to achieve? What do you want from it?
Good afternoon, Stephen, and good afternoon to the viewers. This summit really should be focusing on understanding how we can implement the recommendations coming out of the G20, and also just on the back of COP30. If there's anything that's been clear is that we really need to focus now on action and making these things come to life. So the summit is trying to make sure that we can showcase what's already been done, because we mustn't think we're starting from zero on these issues, understanding exactly where some of those challenges are, but I think really inspiring this collaboration between business, government and society to be able to land on the key things we know that need to be achieved to mitigate climate risk and to adapt.
I mean, one of the big things, these things, Shameela, always boil down to the same thing, money and who's going to pay for it, right? One of the fundamental questions is, will richer countries help poorer countries finance their transition away from fossil fuels? There was the COP summit, which ended last week. There was the G20 this weekend. Do you believe things are kind of heading in that direction? I realise as soon as you get to a sort of international diplomacy meeting, this issue becomes very contentious.
It does become contentious, Stephen, and I think the outcomes from COP are perhaps not as positive, I think, as we would have liked them to be in terms of momentum around the commitment of the money. But I think what it does say is that when we're looking at it from the G20 declaration perspective, the things that have been encouraged by, after having, I think, looked at it for a number of years, is how we're seeing the agendas come together and not sitting as disparate parts, because you have a COP30, you've got a G20, in our case for business, we've got a B20, and do these things talk to each other? Because there's so many commonalities in the themes. But what was really encouraging from the COP, the declaration from the G20, was actually seeing that come together and making explicit reference to the issues that the COP covers as well. And so that is encouraging for the money flow perspective. There have been declarations coming out of COP that I think effectively say that we're going to have more conversations around the money flow, and that is in preparation for the next COP next year. But what is also encouraging is if you use together what's come out of the G20 is the actual focus on the issues such as debt relief. Because when you look at money coming in, we also need to look at the money that we're spending as countries. And so if we're having to borrow money to pay for a number of the things we need to pay for to be able to become more resilient, the debt that we have to pay back, and if that is actually not priced correctly, for example, means that a bigger part of your fiscus is actually then debt, rather than actually being invested back into the economy for things like building resilience to climate change, for actually supporting on social mechanisms and so on and so forth. So those two need to be looked at together, which is why the G20 work streams have been hugely encouraging. And I think I would really advocate for saying we need to see these things as one bigger picture rather than disparate conferences.
Business is a big part of this. Business brings capital, right? And this is where the money will have to come from. But business also uses a lot of energy. What do you think South African businesses should be doing to help prevent climate change?
So there's no doubt that we've already seen some of the action being taken by business. And the first thing, of course, completely to your point, Stephen, is the need to start to reduce, I think, the energy intensity firstly, but of course, just the carbon profile and start decarbonizing the grid in its entirety. And of course, just how businesses operate and the type of energy that they use. And the two, of course, are interrelated. We still have sort of 80% of our energy in the country coming from coal-powered fire stations. And we know that that is shifting, though. We've seen a huge amount of renewables come on just in the last 2 years compared to even 10 years of the REIPP program prior to that. So those are huge encouraging signals that we see. This morning at the opening of the summit, we had Minister for Cooperative Governance and Traditional Affairs, Minister Tlhabisa, speaking about how much has actually come on and his, real push for saying we need to get more of this on. We need businesses to do that. And I think applauding the gains that have been made and an acknowledgement that we do need to work now towards cleaner energy sources. So businesses are doing that in a number of ways. I think we saw that with the lift of the cap off on self-generation, which happened under the energy plan a few years ago, the sort of emergency interventions. A huge amount came onto the grid from businesses. Of course, that was more about energy security, but what it did say is that it can be done and has built a platform for how this can be done into the future. From the money perspective, Stephen, one of the clear things coming out is that we do need to dig deeper domestically to be able to find the money to do this. And so the innovative financing solutions, also being able to tap different sources of money. A lot has been said about what are we doing about the institutional investment that sits in the country, for example, from pension funds, and being able to invest in the infrastructure that can actually power the decarbonization, for one. And secondly, how do we make better use of even the concessional lines of funding that come in from global finance flows and get that into the real economy in a meaningful way. So those are the two areas. And then, of course, to back that has to be the real focus on industrial planning so that there's certainty, there's policy certainty, and the incentive mechanisms to make that go where it needs to go.
And Shameela, you mentioned Eskom and the pollution that comes from coal firing electricity. But I mean, if you look at where most of our pollution comes from, it's really from just two big companies. Okay, so Eskom's one, Sasol is the other. And there's a lot of pressure on them both to change. And these things don't happen very quickly, but they do need to happen. And if they do, by the way, they completely change Africa's emissions picture. Do you think they're changing quickly enough? I realize it's a big, complicated, difficult question.
And Stephen, you're absolutely right. It is complicated. I think from what we've seen is certainly the positive intent to be able to do that. The challenges that we do find is that that transition needs to happen in a way that is inclusive and that is just. I know we talk about the just transition a lot, and completely to your point, those two big emitters really sit with a lot of the challenge that we need to look at. And so I think that there is a lot of positive intent about the just transition. No, it's not easy. Is it going fast enough? I think most of us will argue it probably isn't. But we have Sasol and Eskom here today. And I think it's really positive intention about where that could be going. What we really need to do now is to see that those plans come to fruition and that we're able to do that. The justice element and the inclusive element are critical ones because we do need to take communities along. And we also know that it is an imperative for long-term economic resilience.
Shameela, thank you. Shameela Soobramoney is the CEO of the National Business Initiative, part, of course, of that summit, in fact, hosting it. Well, still